Hi, everyone. It's Lynette coming from what normally would be sunny Southern California, but it is rainy California. It'll be raining till Tuesday, which is kind of nice. It's mid-November and we don't get much rain here. So whenever we do get it, it's nice. It's nice and I enjoy it. So let's get into First Peter and my questions. So the first time I read this, when we did the observations, I read a lot. Well, some of the observations we read about highlighted the suffering. And when I read this again for the questions, I kind of seen it through a different lens. I seen it through more the lens of a new believer learning how to navigate the weeds of their old life while stepping into this new identity in Christ. And I see new believers that may not be facing violent persecutions, but more of dealing with confusion or family tension, possibly old habits pulling them back, social rejection, and spiritual growing pains. And Peter's trying to teach them how to live faithfully in the middle of all this confusion. So, starting with chapter 1, I called it Identity and Exile. Peter calls them elect exiles. And so this raised several questions. Are they literally exiles or socially displaced because of conversion? Did following Christ cause family or tribal rejection? And how does the word exile feel to a brand new believer? So Peter lists regions spread across Asia Minor, suggesting they were scattered and isolated. And that led me to wonder how connected they felt to each other. Did they have community? We know that when somebody converts to Christianity, we always encourage community, get into community, find people like-minded. And I wonder how they felt back then. Did they have that? Or were they feeling alone and isolated? And so we also read that Peter quotes the Old Testament, which suggests some believers had Jewish backgrounds or lived in a mixed faith household, which was common in the AME. I noted some key identity themes in chapter 1, that being born again into a living hope in 1:3, the imperishable inheritance in 1:4, being protected by the power of God in 1:5. I'm called to holy conduct in 1:5. And so Peter really focusing on you don't belong to your past anymore. Going into chapter 2, I'm calling it living as new people in old environments. And so in chapter 2, Peter calls them, he notes that they are the living stones, that they're a chosen race, and that royal priesthood. Those were some of the words that were highlighted to me. And these are powerful identity statements. So for an individual that's not following Christ, learning their identity and who God calls them to be is so important. I mean, we see that now, that when somebody gives their life to Christ, like trying to learn their identity, and what does that even mean? And so I can't imagine it. Well, maybe it could be a lot different, right? Because there were so many pagan beliefs, and learning that new identity was going to be important. And so what I wrote, some of the questions, is Peter reassuring them that God sees them even if society does not? And is he trying to make them feel seen when they feel so unseen at this time? Peter also instructs them to abstain from fleshly lust. Don't go back to their old ways. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. Submit to every human institution. So he's encouraged them to still follow the rules, if they're slaves, to still honor the master and to follow the Roman and the Roman laws. And so that made me wonder, are there some people calling themselves followers of Christ, but they're still living like they used to? Are they still going to the same places? Are they still behaving and participating in old rituals? And is Peter trying to guide them to gentle transformation? I think he is. I think he's trying to do his best to say, hey, I see this is hard, but this is what you have to do. And then in chapter 2, he ends it with Christ also suffered, leaving you an example, basically telling them that Jesus walked a misunderstanding and rejection, and the ultimate rejection, right at the end, that he died for sins that he didn't commit. And so being part of being rejected when you choose to follow Christ is normal. And that goes not only then, but that goes for us now. When we follow Christ, we're not going to fit in and we're going to stand out. Well, we should stand out, anyways. Chapter 3 talks about relationships, marriage, and community. I thought it was kind of interesting that Peter starts with women. And so is it because they bore the greatest risk? Because women were not honored back then. They were not seen. Were they more vulnerable? Being, if you were a Christian wife, married still to a husband that followed the pagan rituals, and how that felt, right? If you had to honor your husband who was still participating in pagan rituals, did you participate in the pagan rituals, or did you not honor him? And so I think there's a lot of confusion there when it says still submit to your husbands, but what if your husband wants you to do a sacrifice that you're not supposed to be doing anymore? So there's so much there. Peter also does husbands honor your wives, and that goes both ways. What if your wife was still participating in some of the Greek mythology and in the things of that? He tells them to honor her. So I can't even imagine the amount of conflict, but I don't think it's any less than what happens today when a woman gets saved and yet her husband hasn't been saved yet. How does she honor him when he still is going to the bar every weekend and coming in at 2 a.m. or dragging her? He wants her to go, he wants her to go with him. And so all of those struggles. It would have been radically countercultural in the Greco-Roman world for wives to have to be honored, right? Because women were not seen at that time. So that kind of tells us that, Peter was speaking to these real tensions in the household. So going on to chapter 4, I called it Leaving the Past and Living New. That Peter writes, the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles 4:3. And so that led me to ask, what does he mean by enough time in the past? And is Peter freeing them from the guilt? Or is he saying you don't need to revisit who you used to be? Like, we get it, you did that, that's who you were, but this is who you are now. He also notes that they are surprised when you don't run with them anymore. And he says that in 4:4. And this is just kind of highlighting that their old friends are going to be surprised when they walk away, which that's the same then, it's the same now. So there's also some contrast with God's will versus the old desires, human judgment versus divine judgment, past addictions, and being sober-minded. And so I see that, I guess, just kind of the questions. I don't know if I had questions on this one because it's so relatable to right now. I mean, this is such a perfect book for the new believer. Again, Peter uses Old Testament ideas and scripture showing that there was interracial relationships, or it was a mixed crowd. Now we have Israelites living with Gentiles, and so it must have been, it just must have been complicated. So going into chapter 5, I'm calling it Humility, Leadership, and Resisting to the Old Patterns. Some of the things that spoke to me were shepherd the flock voluntarily, not under compulsion. And this led some questions. Is Peter teaching leaders not to rule like Roman authorities, but like Christ? Is he guiding leaders to create safety for vulnerable new believers? And so he tells them that they'll receive the unfading crown of glory, which led me to wonder, did pagan religions teach eternal blessing, or is Peter introducing something entirely new? Um, Also, there is some Peter writes like, humble yourselves and cast your anxiety on him. Be alert. Your adversary, the devil's prowls, and resist. And this made me wonder, like, were they anxious about spiritual retaliation from old gods? Were old friendships pulling them back into their former life? It made me wonder, like, were they getting cursed? I know when I left Catholicism, there were some family members that were really concerned about my salvation. So I wonder when they left, like their pagan religion, were there family members that were concerned, or maybe, speaking death over their life, or um, anything of that. So Peter ends 5 with, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace will perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you, which is a very strong ending for believers feeling unsure or spiritually unstable. Saying, don't worry, like, this God, Yahweh, he will establish you, he will protect you. He is um, the one and only true God. And so that's kind of my questions of First Peter. And I hope you enjoyed them. Thanks. Bye.